Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're doing a deep dive on something that could really hit home for a lot of you, especially if you're part of the Indian American community.
Oh, yeah.
And that is the possible end of birthright citizenship here in the US.
Definitely a big one.
And to really unpack this whole thing, we're going to be looking at a YouTube video that breaks down the super complicated issue and what it could mean for families, just like yours.
What's wild is that we're not just talking about some, hypothetical what-if scenario here.
Right.
This is a real proposal, a real thing that could totally upend the lives of millions.
Absolutely. So let's get right into it.
Let's do it.
Can you give us a little refresher on what birthright citizenship actually means here in the U.S.?
Basically, it comes down to this. If you are born on U.S. soil, you're automatically a U.S. citizen.
Boom.
Doesn't matter where your parents are from or what their immigration status is.
Interesting.
And this right comes straight from the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which was added way back in 1868.
Wow.
And it was mainly put in place to grant citizenship to formerly enslaved people.
So it's been like a core part of U.S. law for what, over 150 years?
A long time.
But this whole automatic citizenship thing, it's not really the global standard, is it?
You're absolutely right. It's pretty unique to the U.S.
Huh.
In tons of other countries, citizenship goes by your parents' nationality.
Okay.
So, let's say you're born in France, but your parents are Italian.
Right.
You'd probably be Italian, not French.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So why is birthright citizenship becoming such a hot topic again? It feels like this isn't the first time we've heard rumblings about this.
Yeah, it's come up before, for sure. But this time, it's really being pushed by President-elect Donald Trump.
Okay.
He's made it clear that he wants to end birthright citizenship.
Interesting.
He argues that it basically encourages what he calls birth tourism and illegal immigration.
I see.
His claim is that it kind of incentivizes people to come to the U.S. just so they can have kids who are automatically citizens.
Hold on a sec. Trump keeps saying this birth tourism thing is a big deal,
Right.
but is there actually any evidence to back that up?
That is the million-dollar question, and it's a super hotly debated one.
I bet.
Critics of the idea say that birth tourism is really just a tiny thing,
Okay.
and there's no hard data to show that it's a huge, widespread problem.
Interesting.
They point out that getting a U.S. visa just to give birth is already illegal and pretty tough to do.
Okay, so it sounds like how big of a deal birth tourism is kind of up for debate.
For sure.
But even if Trump really wants to end birthright citizenship, can he actually do it? Amending the Constitution, that's got to be incredibly hard to do.
You are not wrong. It is a really high bar to clear.
I imagine.
To actually get rid of birthright citizenship, you need to either amend the 14th Amendment, which requires a supermajority vote in Congress, and then ratification by 3/4 of the states.
Wow.
Or you'd have to get the Supreme Court to completely overturn its past rulings on the issue.
So not exactly a walk in the park.
Definitely not.
It sounds like there are some pretty big legal hurdles there.
Huge.
But let's say, just for argument's sake, that Trump somehow manages to push this through.
Okay.
What would that mean for Indian families living in the U.S.?
Right.
I think this is where it gets really personal for a lot of our listeners.
Absolutely. We're talking about a community of over 5.4 million people,
Wow.
and a lot of them are immigrants. So for them, this policy change could be completely life-altering.
Yeah.
So let's look at two main groups here: green card holders and people on H-1B visas.
Okay, sounds good. Let's start with the green card holders.
Okay.
What changes for families in that situation if birthright citizenship goes away?
Well, right now, if you have a green card and your child is born in the U.S., they're automatically a citizen.
Right.
But if this policy changes, their U.S.-born kids might not get that automatic citizenship anymore.
Wow.
Instead, they might inherit their parents' citizenship,
Uh-huh.
which means they'd have to go through a whole other process like naturalization to become U.S. citizens.
So even with a green card, there's no guarantee of citizenship for your kids anymore.
That's right.
That's a big deal.
Yeah.
What about families on H-1B visas?
This is where it gets even trickier. An H-1B visa is a temporary work visa.
Right?
And if birthright citizenship ends, their kid's status would be tied directly to that visa. So if the parent's visa expires or gets revoked, the child's legal status becomes super shaky too.
Wow.
even if they were born and raised in the U.S.
That creates so much uncertainty for families.
For sure.
And what about people on other temporary visas or those who are undocumented?
Yeah.
What happens to their kids in this scenario?
That's a really important point, and it raises some serious red flags.
Yeah.
For those groups, the situation could get incredibly complicated.
I can imagine.
It could lead to a whole new set of legal and social challenges.
Right?
It's not hard to picture a scenario where children born in the U.S. could basically become stateless.
Stateless?
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
It means they wouldn't be recognized as citizens by any country.
Oh, wow.
Think about what that would mean. No passport, limited access to education and healthcare restrictions on travel and getting a job, and just a constant fear of deportation.
That's scary.
Yeah, it's a very real and frightening possibility for those born in the U.S. if birthright citizenship is taken away.
That's a pretty dire situation.
It is.
So if it's so difficult to amend the Constitution, how is Trump even thinking about going about ending birthright citizenship?
Well, he's mentioned the idea of using an executive order,
Okay.
which would basically be him, the president,
Yeah.
instructing federal agencies to enforce a new interpretation of the 14th Amendment,
I see.
requiring at least one parent to be a U.S. citizen or permanent resident for a child to get automatic citizenship.
So it's like going around Congress.
Pretty much.
But that sounds, well, legally iffy, to say the least.
It definitely is. And that's why a lot of legal experts think an executive order on this would be challenged in court right away.
Makes sense.
The big question would be whether the president actually has the power to reinterpret the Constitution like that. And that would probably end up being decided by the Supreme Court.
So with all this uncertainty and potential legal back and forth, what's the likely outcome here? Can Trump actually pull this off?
That is a million-dollar question. And honestly, no one really knows for sure.
Yeah,
He's definitely facing a tough battle, both legally and politically.
for sure.
But just the fact that this is even being considered is causing a ton of anxiety and fear for families who could be directly affected.
And it's not just the potential policy change itself, it's the not knowing the stress it's creating in the meantime.
Absolutely.
This is real life for people, not just some political game.
Right.
Now let's shift gears a little bit and look at the history of birthright citizenship in the U.S.
Okay.
Why has the 14th Amendment, and especially its citizenship clause, been such a source of debate over the years?
You know, it's really interesting to look back at why the 14th Amendment was drafted in the first place.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about giving citizenship to people who had been enslaved. It was about making sure their rights as citizens were solid and that they had equal protection under the law.
So let's dive into that historical context.
Yes, sir.
What was going on in the U.S. back in 1868 when this amendment was passed?
Well, the U.S. was just coming out of the Civil War.
Right.
It was a deeply divided nation,
Yeah.
really struggling with how to integrate formerly enslaved people into society.
I can imagine.
And there was a lot of resistance, especially in the South, to giving them full citizenship rights.
And the 14th Amendment was meant to deal with that resistance.
Exactly. It was a way to guarantee in the Constitution that anyone born in the U.S., no matter their race or whether they'd been enslaved, was a citizen
Wow.
and had the right to equal protection under the law. It was a huge step forward for civil rights.
So it seems like the 14th Amendment was really meant to fix a historical wrong and make sure everyone born on U.S. soil was equal.
Absolutely.
But even after it passed, there were still people trying to challenge it and weaken it,
Yeah,
right?
It wasn't all smooth sailing,
Especially the citizenship clause.
especially that one. There were constant legal battles and attempts to limit the scope of the 14th Amendment, particularly when it came to the children of immigrants.
What were some of the arguments they used to try and challenge birthright citizenship back then?
Well,
Did they sound anything like what we're hearing today?
Some people argued that the amendment didn't apply to children born to immigrants who are in the U.S. illegally. And that kind of echoes the current debate about anchor babies
I see.
and the idea that undocumented immigrants are taking advantage of birthright citizenship.
So this debate has been going on for over a century.
It has.
It makes you think about what could happen if the 14th Amendment was changed today. If its original goal was to protect the rights of formerly enslaved people, would changing it now kind of undermine that?
That's a really tough question that legal scholars are trying to figure out right now.
Yeah.
It brings up these really complex issues about how constitutional law changes over time
Right.
and how we interpret what the framers meant back then in today's world.
That's a heavy question with no easy answers.
For sure.
But let's bring it back to the present.
Okay.
We've talked about how Indian families might be affected if birthright citizenship ends.
Right.
But how could this policy change affect the U.S. as a whole?
That's where things get even more complicated.
Okay.
The people who support ending birthright citizenship say that it would reduce illegal immigration
Okay.
and what they see as birth tourism,
Right.
which lines up with Trump's position.
Yeah.
They think it would make people less likely to come to the U.S. just to have kids who'd then be citizens.
But those claims about birth tourism are kind of shaky, right?
They are.
Like we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
And even if we ignore that for a second, wouldn't ending birthright citizenship just create a bunch of new problems for the U.S.?
That's a big concern that a lot of critics bring up.
I bet.
They say it could create a whole class of people who are born in the U.S. but aren't citizens, creating what are called stateless individuals.
We touched on that earlier.
We did.
But can you explain more about what that would actually mean for those people and for the U.S.?
Imagine being born in the U.S., growing up here, going to school here,
Yeah.
but not having the rights and privileges of being a citizen.
Wow.
These stateless individuals could face huge obstacles,
Yeah.
from limited access to education and healthcare to restrictions on travel and work.
That's a lot.
They would live with this constant fear of being deported,
Oh, gosh.
even though the U.S. is the only home they've ever known.
It sounds like creating a whole group of stateless people would go against the very idea of equality and opportunity that the U.S. is supposed to be about.
Yeah.
And wouldn't it also create a massive bureaucratic headache?
Oh, absolutely.
Think about all the resources it would take to keep track of everyone's citizenship status.
You're right. The administrative costs would be astronomical.
Wow.
It would take a huge investment in bureaucracy and enforcement to manage this new category of residents.
Right.
And it wouldn't even address the root causes of undocumented immigration.
It wouldn't.
It could actually make existing social and economic inequalities even worse.
It seems like ending birthright citizenship wouldn't actually solve the problems it claims to, and it could cause a whole bunch of new ones.
Yeah.
It feels like this is less about finding practical solutions and more about scoring political points.
It's definitely a super politicized issue.
Yeah,
And one that gets people really fired up on both sides.
absolutely.
But it's crucial to look past all the political talk and really examine what the consequences could be in the real world.
For sure.
Yeah,
We need to think about how this kind of major policy change would affect real people.
definitely.
Now let's zero in on those human stories.
Okay.
In our next segment, we'll look at some specific examples and dig deeper into how the potential end of birthright citizenship could impact different types of Indian families living in the U.S.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating to look back at why they came up with the 14th Amendment in the first place.
Okay.
It wasn't just about saying, okay, now you're citizens.
Right.
It was about solidifying those rights,
Right.
making sure they had equal protection under the law.
So let's get into that historical context then.
Sure.
Paint us a picture of what was happening in the U.S. back in 1868 when this amendment got passed.
Well, the U.S. was just coming out of the Civil War,
Yeah, huge shift.
a totally divided nation trying to figure out how to bring formerly enslaved people into society.
Wow.
And there was a ton of pushback, especially in the South, against giving them full citizenship rights.
So the 14th Amendment was kind of like a response to that pushback.
Exactly. It was a way to make sure, like, write it into the Constitution
Yeah.
that anybody born in the U.S., didn't matter their race or if they'd been enslaved, was a citizen and had equal protection under the law.
Huh.
Huge step forward for civil rights.
It sounds like a really pivotal moment.
It was.
So it seems like the 14th Amendment was really about righting a historical wrong,
Right.
making sure everyone born on U.S. soil was truly equal.
Absolutely.
But even after it was passed, there were still attempts to challenge it, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It wasn't a done deal.
Especially the part about citizenship.
Yeah, especially that one.
Yeah.
There were always legal battles and people trying to narrow the scope of the 14th Amendment,
Interesting.
especially when it came to children of immigrants.
What were some of the arguments they used back then to challenge birthright citizenship? Do they have any similarities to what we're hearing today?
Some people argued that the amendment didn't apply to kids born to immigrants who were here illegally,
Okay.
which is similar to the debate today about anchor babies
Right.
and the idea that undocumented immigrants are exploiting birthright citizenship.
So this isn't a new conversation at all.
Not at all. It's been simmering for over a century.
It makes you wonder what could happen if they actually changed the 14th Amendment today.
Yeah.
I mean, its original intent was to protect the rights of formerly enslaved people.
Right.
Would messing with it now kind of go against that original intention?
That's a really tough question, and it's something that legal scholars are wrestling with right now. It brings up these really complex issues about how our understanding of the Constitution changes over time.
Yeah.
And how we interpret what the framers meant way back then in the context of today's world.
It's a heavy question for sure.
It is.
But let's bring it back to the present.
Yeah.
We've talked about how ending birthright citizenship could impact Indian families.
Right.
But what about the U.S. as a whole?
How would this policy change affect the entire country?
Yeah, that's a big one.
It's where things get even more multi-layered.
Okay.
People who support ending birthright citizenship say it would cut down on illegal immigration
Okay.
and what they consider birth tourism,
Right.
which aligns with what Trump has been saying.
Right.
They believe it would discourage people from coming to the U.S. just to have kids who would automatically be citizens.
But like we said before, those claims about birth tourism are pretty debatable.
They are.
And even if we set that aside, wouldn't getting rid of birthright citizenship just create a whole new set of problems for the U.S.?
That's a major concern a lot of critics raise.
Yeah, I can see why.
They argue it could lead to a whole group of people who were born here but aren't citizens, creating what are called stateless individuals.
We talked about that briefly before.
We did.
Can you break down what that would mean for those individuals and for the U.S. as a whole?
Imagine being born in the U.S., growing up here, go to school here,
Yeah.
but not having the rights and privileges of citizenship.
Wow.
These stateless individuals would face a ton of obstacles.
Right.
Everything from limited access to education and healthcare to restrictions on travel and work.
That's a lot.
They would constantly be afraid of being deported,
That's a tough situation.
even though the U.S. is the only place they've ever known as home.
It sounds like creating this class of stateless people would go against everything the U.S. supposedly stands for.
It does.
You know, equality, opportunity.
Yeah.
Plus, wouldn't it be a logistical nightmare?
Oh, yeah, totally.
I mean, think about all the resources it would take to track and manage the citizenship status of all these individuals.
The administrative costs would be through the roof.
Wow.
It would require a massive investment in bureaucracy and enforcement just to handle this new category of residents.
You're right.
And it wouldn't even address the root causes of undocumented immigration.
It wouldn't.
It might actually make things worse.
How so?
It could deepen existing social and economic inequalities.
It seems like ending birthright citizenship wouldn't fix the problems it claims to fix.
Right.
And it could actually create a bunch of brand new problems.
Exactly.
It feels like this is less about finding real solutions and more about just scoring political points.
It's definitely become a very politicized issue,
For sure.
and it stirs up a lot of strong feelings on both sides.
Absolutely.
But it's really important to look beyond the political rhetoric and focus on the real-world impact this could have.
Absolutely. We have to think about how this kind of major change would affect people's lives.
Definitely.
Now let's shift gears a bit and zoom in on those human stories.
Okay.
In our next segment, we'll explore some specific scenarios, and we'll dive even deeper into how the potential end of birthright citizenship could affect different types of Indian families living in the U.S.
Sounds good.
All right, so let's get super specific here.
Okay.
We've talked about the big picture stuff, but now let's really put ourselves in the shoes of Indian families living in the U.S.
Yeah.
Imagine how this potential change could actually play out in their lives.
Right.
A good place to start, I think, is with folks on those H-1B visas.
Okay.
Let's say you're an Indian couple working here in the U.S.
Right.
You're on an H-1B visa,
Yeah.
and you just had a baby.
Okay.
Right now, your child is automatically a U.S. citizen,
Right.
but if birthright citizenship goes away, their legal status is totally tied to your visa.
Exactly.
And we know those visas are temporary,
Yep.
they have to be renewed,
Uh-huh.
and they can even be revoked.
That's right.
So their whole future in the U.S.,
Yeah.
the only country they've ever known, becomes a big question mark.
It does.
That's a lot of pressure for a family,
It is.
especially one with a newborn.
Absolutely. Their whole life here. Whether they can stay here, go to school here, work here, get health care,
Right.
it all depends on their parents' visa status.
That's a lot of uncertainty.
It's a level of instability that no family should have to deal with.
I can imagine that uncertainty would have a ripple effect.
For sure.
It could impact their education, their career choices.
Yeah, everything.
What about Indian citizens who have green cards and are thinking about starting a family here in the U.S.?
Right now, they know that their child born here will automatically be a U.S. citizen.
Right.
But if birthright citizenship ends, that guarantee is gone.
Wow.
They'd have to consider the possibility that their child might inherit their Indian citizenship
Right.
and have to go through a separate process to become a U.S. citizen.
That's a huge decision to make.
It is.
Right now, having a child in the U.S. as a green card holder gives you peace of mind.
For sure.
But this potential change makes things so much more complicated.
Yeah.
It's almost like you're gambling with your child's future.
It definitely adds a lot of risk and uncertainty.
It's not just the legal stuff.
Right.
Going through the naturalization process. It's the emotional toll, too.
Absolutely.
The stress of not knowing what will happen.
Yeah.
The possibility of being separated.
Right.
The feeling of being in limbo.
That's a lot to carry.
It's really tough to think about families being torn apart
It is.
just because of bureaucratic red tape.
Yeah.
And beyond individual families, what could this mean for the Indian American community as a whole?
This community has done so much here in the U.S.
Absolutely.
They've contributed so much to the economy, to culture, to society.
For sure.
But if the U.S. starts to seem less welcoming to immigrant families,
Yeah.
it could really discourage future generations.
And that would be a loss for everyone.
It would.
Not just Indian Americans, but the entire country.
For sure.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening.
It has.
It's made this whole issue so much more complex.
Definitely. We've looked at the legal stuff, the history, the potential consequences for individuals and for the whole country.
Right.
And the real human stories at the heart of it all.
And while we don't know for sure what will happen with birthright citizenship,
Right.
it's clear that this conversation is far from over.
Absolutely. This is an ongoing discussion, and it's one that we all need to be a part of.
So to everyone listening, especially those in the Indian American community,
Yeah.
stay informed, keep talking about this, and make your voices heard.
Absolutely.
Your perspectives, your experiences are so important in shaping how immigration policy unfolds here in the U.S.
For sure.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.
Hello everyone, welcome back to our channel US Immigration News. We hope you are doing great. In this video, we are going to talk about end of Birthright US citizenship, what it would mean for lack of Indians. The potential end of Birthright citizenship in the United States, as proposed by President-elect Donald Trump, could create significant ramifications for many Indian families residing in the country. Trump articulated is a belief that the current policy promotes illegal immigration and birth tourism, arguing that it undermines the integrity of US immigration laws. If enacted, this policy could dramatically alter the landscape for Indian in the US, affecting not only citizenship but also broader immigration dynamics. Currently, the US is one of the few nations that grants citizenship to children born on its soil, a right enshrined in the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. This practice has been a key for many Indian families as it automatically confers citizenship to children, regardless of their parents' immigration status. With about 5.4 million Indian Americans, many of whom are immigrants holding green cards or working on H-1B visa, the implication of changing this policy could be profound. Children born to Indian parents under these circumstances might no longer automatically acquire US citizenship, instead inheriting their parents' legal status. This could lead to significant uncertainty, requiring families to navigate complex immigration processes to secure their children's citizenship, potentially disqualifying them from numerous opportunities. Moreover, Trump's broader anti-immigration stance, encompassing tighter restrictions on students' visa and H-1B programs, suggests that many aspects of immigrating, working, and living in the US may become increasingly challenging for all immigrants, particularly the Indian population. Legal experts have noted that if Trump were to pursue and end birthright citizenship, he would face substantial legal hurdles. The right to birthright citizenship is deeply rooted in US law and would require either a constitutional amendment or a Supreme Court ruling to overturn exciting precedent, both of which are daunting tasks given the political and legal complexities involved. While Trump has suggested using executive orders to effectuate this change, any such move would likely lead to significant legal challenges based on the 14th Amendment. Historical precedent indicates that amending this cornerstone of citizenship rights would face not just legal obstacles but also strong public opposition. As such, while the Trump administration may push for this controversial agenda, the road towards implementation is a fraud with hurdles that may render it a largely symbolic rather than actionable. Ultimately, the potential end of birthright citizenship poses a complex array of challenges for Indian Americans, threatening to disrupt their status and stability in the US.